It's official. After much speculation and days of opinions flying in all directions, Kamala Harris has officially named Tim Walz as her vice presidential pick. And the backlash from Republicans was fast and furious. Former President Trump said in an interview on Wednesday that he was shocked at the pick and couldn't be more thrilled. While his VP pick, J.D. Vance, had this to say.
Tim Walz's record is a joke. He's been one of the most far-left radicals in the entire United States government.
The pair kicked off a multi-state tour Tuesday night with a raucous rally in Philadelphia.
Every day in the White House, I'll have Vice President Harris's back. And we'll have yours. We'll sleep when we're dead. Say it with me. We aren't going back.
But the pick this week had a lot of voters scratching their heads. According to a YouGov poll released the night of the rally, the electorate is split on what to think of Walz, and a whopping 45% say they just don't know enough about him. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro was expected by many to be Harris's pick, but at the rally, he said he was happy being Pennsylvania's governor and to be supporting the ticket.
I'm going to be working my tail off to make sure we make Kamala Harris and Tim Walz the next leaders of the United States of America.
Joining us now to break it all down is the Hill's White House correspondent, Alex Gangitano. Alex, thank you so much for joining me here today. Want to talk about the sweepstakes. Tim Walz is a relatively unknown figure in national politics. Could you walk us through where he's coming from and what his tenure in Minnesota's governor mansion has really been like?
Yeah, so Tim Walz, before he was governor of Minnesota, was a congressman for over a decade in Washington. Before that, he was a teacher, he's a football coach, he's a military vet. So a lot of backstory there. But ever since he's become governor of Minnesota, we've seen him lean more into the progressive space. He enacted some policies like paid medical leave, tax credit for low-income families. He's enacted gun control prevention laws, reproductive rights laws. We've also seen some pro-immigration laws like benefits for undocumented immigrants, including free in-state college tuition. So these are all things that have, I think, the Harris campaign were excited about. They, of course, want to see gun control and reproductive rights laws on a national level, but they're also things that have been the reason why he's labeled as a progressive as the governor, especially compared to his time as a member of Congress, when I think he was considered more moderate.
Yeah, there was certainly an evolution there, and we've seen Democrats and Republicans talk about. So I want to get more into what was the thinking behind Harris picking Tim Walz? How much chemistry did they have? Was this about policy or personality? What really played into it?
Yeah, it was interesting as we hear about how these meetings went, these vetting meetings, and then this past weekend, the final sit-down meetings. Out of that, we heard that Harris just really connected during her meeting with Walz. That was something that the campaign has said, that the vibes were just good, which is something that we know that she was looking for because of her relationship with President Biden, which is very strong. The two of them have lunch regularly. He makes sure she has a seat at the table. So she was looking to replicate that. And I think just feeling a connection during that final meeting was huge for her. It was interesting because Governor Walz, actually, Harris knows him the least out of the other frontrunners. When I went through, backstories with her and Governor Shapiro or Senator Mark Kelly, she did work with them more regularly, knew them better. But I guess she just felt a strong connection and thought that she could have a good governing relationship with the governor.
Yeah, when you work so closely with someone, that's obviously very important to have that connection and that chemistry. But Alex, it's so interesting because once Biden dropped out, endorsed Harris, and we started talking about who her vice presidential contender would be, Tim Walz initially was not on the list of potential contenders. In fact, he seemed to be a bit of a dark horse figure of the sweepstakes. How did his stock rise so fast?
Yeah, it definitely felt like a dark horse figure. I mean, covering Washington, we know Tim Walz definitely from his time as a member of Congress, and that he's the governor now. He's also very active in the Governors Association. But besides that, he wasn't the name on everybody's what everybody was saying when Harris first became the presumptive nominee, as you mentioned. And so he actually then just started doing a lot of television appearances, a lot of, MSNBC hits in which he would take on Trump or Senator J.D. Vance directly. And he also coined the term weird to describe some of, their policies and why they're talking about things like IVF, or why they're so interested in how many children, families have, or whatever else. Tim Walz decided that was just weird, and he was going to label it that. The Harris campaign has been using that now. Vice President Harris herself has used that when we've seen it in her speeches and fundraisers. So it's been interesting how, he was kind of the backstory to that. But his stock, I think, really rose because the campaign and other Democrats saw that he was somebody who would go on television and not afraid to directly take on former President Trump and talk about, what shortcomings he thinks that the former president has. And it seemed like it was over a week, and then suddenly everybody was talking about Governor Walz.
So, Alex, how much do these picks ultimately matter? I mean, how much could Tim Walz and J.D. Vance, being white guys from the Midwest, play a role in winning states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so it's definitely an interesting pick looking at someone from Minnesota, considering that's not a swing state. It's a state that Democrats feel confident that they can carry. But the fact that the location of Minnesota, the fact that he's from the Midwest, has this, grew up in a rural background, working on the family farm. These are all things that I think the Harris campaign is hoping will resonate with voters in places like Michigan, Ohio, even Pennsylvania, where Harris needs some help. She's someone from California. So that's another deep blue state that, Democrats don't have to, really be focused on this election, whereas they really need to focus on these key swing states. And a lot of them are in, the Midwest. And so I think they're hoping that his kind of demeanor and Midwest charm can help get some of those voters, even if he's not the governor of their state in particular. That's also something that, as you mentioned, former President Trump was looking at J.D. Vance as a helpful hand in the Midwest as well. And in some of these, more union towns, appeal to the labor vote, those were the people that he was trying to get with the pick of Vance, who's a senator from Ohio.
So on the flip side of that, what are some of the key constituencies that Tim Walz could appeal to?
Yeah, so I think his background, growing up in rural Nebraska, actually, that was something that, I think they're trying to see if his story can resonate with people who have kind of, had a similar background as him, people from the Midwest who, can listen to his demeanor on television and see themselves in him. He also was a teacher. That's a huge demographic of and a really critical voting bloc for Democrats to, get the teachers behind him. And he was a military veteran. And of course, Democrats have been trying, especially the Biden-Harris administration has been focused on appealing to, military families, spouses. That has been a key priority of actually First Lady Jill Biden. So I think getting his military background, talk about it on the campaign trail, I think would be, something that a way for them to try to appeal to military families. So there's a lot of kind of boxes that he checks. And then just people who might not, see somebody, from California or say New York or even Washington, D.C., as the kind of person who can appeal to them, but see somebody from the Midwest as a more appealing figure. So he kind of balances out that ticket there.
He does. But, I've chatted with a lot of Republicans who would argue or say they were relieved that Walz was chosen. And we're already seeing them label Walz as someone who is ultra progressive and who they say doesn't balance out the ticket. Alex, how does the Harris-Walz campaign respond to that?
Yeah, it's a tough call because, she was looking at people from these critical swing states, like a Governor Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania or Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, who are considered more moderates. Mark Kelly is extremely moderate on the border, and that's something that was is a setback for Harris, or challenge for her, to not look so progressive on the border. So it is definitely interesting that she decided to go with a more progressive pick. And, as I mentioned, that his work in the governor's mansion has been labeled as very progressive, especially compared to his work in Congress. I think the Harris campaign is just full speed ahead, ready to just show off that he's a great candidate, show off that he's the person who can take on Trump and Vance, and I think try to prove that he's, a counter to Vance, and also, how critical they think that the labor vote and the Midwest is to their campaign. But it's definitely telling that Republicans might have seen a Shapiro as a tougher candidate to take on, whereas they were kind of relieved, so to say, that he has a more progressive background. But it will definitely be interesting also to see how Walz takes on Vance in the vice presidential debates, because then we would see that more personality coming out versus obviously right now there's so much focus on his progressive policies as governor.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, that debate will certainly be a must-watch debate. And if it happens, I know there's been a lot of debates over the debates, if you will. But Alex Gangitano, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Julia.
When Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance referred to prominent Democratic women as childless cat ladies, he set off a fury of backlash everywhere. But playing nasty and name-calling in politics is nothing new. The Hill staff writer Rafael Bernal goes in depth on the history of mudslinging in the U.S.
Former President Trump has turned mockery and ridicule into a campaign strategy on par with Oppo research and public mobilization. And Trump's favorite tool to mock and ridicule his opponents is the insulting nickname. In 2016, Trump disparaged Hillary Clinton as Crooked Hillary, to the delight of his base and eye rolls from friend and foe. 8 years later, he's tagged pretty much every national political figure with mixed success. But Trump is hardly the first U.S. president to give or take a nasty insult. Abraham Lincoln got called everything from a buffoon to a land pirate in his 1864 bid for re-election. George McClellan, the pro-slavery Union general fired by Lincoln in 1862, ran against Lincoln in 64 using the nickname Ignoramus Abe. A few years earlier, Lincoln was a little wordier in insulting Stephen Douglas. Lincoln said Douglas's arguments were as thin as the homeopathic soup that was made by boiling the shadow of a pigeon that had been starved to death. But of course, tempers were high around the time of the Civil War. The founding fathers were much more civil. Except when Thomas Jefferson said John Adams was a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who is a hideous hermaphrodite character with neither the force and fitness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. We could keep going all the way to Diogenes and Plato trading barbs more than 2,000 years ago. But we'd be forgetting the relative civility of U.S. politics in the TV era. Presidents Kennedy and Nixon kicked off that era with their 1960 debate, where not a single insult was uttered. That's not to say candidates didn't jab at each other, just that they were careful to be civil in public. In 1988, soon-to-be Vice President Dan Quayle was taken aback when Democratic vice presidential nominee Lloyd Bentsen told Quayle he didn't measure up to Kennedy. Almost heartwarming. And voters say they want more of that. A 2019 Pew Research survey found 93% of people didn't want to hear a candidate deliberately mislead about their opponent's record. 91% said attacks on someone's physical appearance are off limits. Well, so much for that. Oh, and 84% of people in the Pew survey said they don't want to hear politicians call their opponents stupid. But in 2024, one presidential campaign is calling their opponent weird, and the other is mocking the opposing candidate's laugh. Voters may say they don't want mudslinging, but it sure seems to work when push comes to shove. And insults are part of the playbook. Writer Saul Alinsky laid it out in his 1971 book, Rules for Radicals. Alinsky's fifth rule says, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. There is no defense. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition, who then react to your advantage.
That's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.